Hello, everyone. This is Seth with the world of Paleoanthropology, and I am so excited to be here on another episode of The Story of Us. I know it's been a little while, and this is the first episode, really the first anything I've done since the birth of my baby boy, and we will see if we can get through this episode uninterrupted. If not, the magic skills of editing will hopefully allow us to make this a smooth episode. But if not, no, I put a lot of work and effort into it. So if you guys can like and subscribe, please do so. We are here today with Dr. Emily Casanova to talk about some pretty interesting things about Neanderthals. Why don't you introduce yourself for a moment? I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
No problem. So again, my name is Dr. Emily Casanova. I'm an assistant professor of neuroscience at Loyola University in New Orleans, and I do research. I teach about brain evolution. That's another one of my things. And for the most part, I have been studying autism for probably, oh gosh, maybe almost 2 decades at this rate. I have a few different foci. My main one is genetics and the paleogenomics that we'll be talking about today. But I'm also very well known for research into autism and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which are connective tissue disorders, which affect a lot of people on the spectrum too. So I kind of have two separate research lives almost, and they don't always cross over that much. So, but today obviously is about paleogenomics, which is definitely one of my big passions. So it's kind of me.
Absolutely. And, I am so excited that we are here and we get to talk because you actually had a paper come out recently that you were the lead author of that before we came into contact, I actually read and shared around because I had found it not only very interesting, but something that I found other people would find quite intriguing, not just because anything with the word Neanderthal draws people to it if it's in the title, but because it really does relate to a lot of people's day-to-day lives and the lives of people that we love and their day-to-day lives. And that's because what you have found is a potential link between autism and Neanderthals and the genes that we have from Neanderthals due to the integration that we've had with them. Can you explain a little bit what you found and what this paper kind of talks about before we get into maybe why you're into this topic?
Sure, sure. So first off, I always like to say nowadays, because I know it's what all the headlines tend to say, and I like to kind of give a little disclaimer. We were studying the potential influence of Neanderthal DNA in autism in modern people across different ethnicities. And we definitely found some very important widespread links. But I do want to say we did not find more Neanderthal DNA in autism.
Mm.
So autistic people are not more Neanderthal. Some people may like that idea, others may not so much. But what we did find was we were really interested in looking at DNA variants that we have inherited from Neanderthals, that are, some of them are, most of them are more common, right? And then there's a subset that are more rare. And we were really interested in some of the rare ones in particular, a lot of times with the idea of, and this is not always a one-to-one case, but a lot of times when you have a rare variant in genetics, it tends to suggest that maybe it's doing something that's at least a little bit deleterious. And at least in the case of Neanderthal DNA, it may continue to be weeded out of the genomes, kind of this very slow, weak purge, right? And so that was in part why we kind of split those into those two major categories. So we found that folks on the autism spectrum are more likely to have more of this rare Neanderthal DNA.
Mm.
So that was kind of our coming from a clinical genetics standpoint. Usually you're looking for rare variants that you primarily see in whatever population you're studying versus your control population. Most ideally, you don't ever see it in the controls, and it only occurs in your clinical population, whatever you're studying. But we do see some of this rare DNA in non-autistic people too. So just to say that if they are doing something that maybe you're not so hot, right? Maybe it's a little bit deleterious. It's probably not severely so. That stuff would have gotten weeded out within the first handful of generations after we intermixed with them. Like the really nasty stuff that, affects fertility, is maybe lethal to the offspring, those would have been weeded out very quickly. Ironically, it's a lot of developmental genes that tend to be have these very low rates of Neanderthal DNA. But there are some still around, and it seems like some of these rare ones are popping up more often in autism. So
Hmm.
it's kind of the big kind of bird's eye view of the paper. And we found the same trend across the three ethnicities, the broad ethnicities that we studied. So the Black non-Hispanic, we didn't have enough to study Black Hispanics, unfortunately, but we had Black non-Hispanic, white Hispanic, and white non-Hispanic subsets within the United States. And we saw the same trend. They weren't always the same variants, so they do seem to be possibly population specific, which is really cool in a way.
Right.
Kind of leads into a whole another set of research studies that I think could go even beyond the Neanderthal genome. But it's a really cool way to study it in that way. But we did see the same trend across the Black non-Hispanic, white Hispanic, and white non-Hispanic populations. So
That is fascinating and arises so many questions that I'm not sure where to begin. I mean, that just opens, I feel like, a floodgate of potential, well, what about this, and this?
yeah.
And I guess my biggest question, and it's probably the hardest one I can ask you, and one
Mm,
that I know you're not going to have an answer for, but I'm going to postulate it anyways as a
okay.
thought experiment.
Sure.
If these traits cause these adaptations, we'll call that, I don't know what to,
Mhm.
these,
Yeah.
you know, behaviors in modern humans when we find them,
Right.
what can we glean they did in Neanderthals? What behaviors did what
Right.
functions did they serve in Neanderthals? And I know there's literally no way of really knowing
Oh
that,
yeah,
but
it's a thought experiment essentially.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I think that's one that a lot of people would be interested in.
Mhm.
Now as somebody who studies genetics, from a clinical perspective, but then also with my foot in kind of the evolutionary biology. I also study a lot of these developmentally related genes. I study how they evolve over time. Newsflash: they don't like to evolve very quickly at all. And so one of the things that so in with Neanderthals, we know that thanks to a certain amount of inbreeding in their
Mhm.
population, they had very small numbers for an extended period of time. So they definitely appeared to have experienced a genetic bottleneck.
Right.
In those circumstances, you increase the likelihood that you are going to pass around deleterious mutations as if they are effectively neutral in a small population, which is why you tend to see recessive disorders in small populations or in populations today that continue to intermarry with relatively close family members, like first degree cousins. Those recessive mutations, you have to have two, right? So one, you're a carrier, it's probably not going to matter too much, especially if you're only living till 30 or 40 years, who cares, right? As a Neanderthal. But if you inherit two, usually they tend to be pretty nasty.
Right.
Um, so you can have these recessive diseases or these carriers in these small populations. So one, we may have inherited some of those that, regardless of the genetic background, um, we may have had to weed those out relatively quickly. That would have been more possible as our numbers expanded, because the larger the numbers, usually then you expect those recessive diseases to decrease, because it's like 50-50 chance every generation, right? And you increase the likelihood that you're going to get rid of it. So we probably have that effect. That on top of that, though, I like to try and help people understand that when we talk about a variant in a gene, or maybe even an outside of a gene, um, a lot of times it's about the context of that DNA variant. So I usually like to give the example of, like, let's say we have two imaginary genes, gene A and gene B, and they sit right next to each other on a chromosome, right? And they like to be expressed together, and they like to work together. So whenever you produce a product for these, it's going to somehow come together. Maybe it's going to form a protein complex that's doing something specific. Those two genes, gene A and gene B, really like to have the same ratios, right? So you can't really you can't mutate one without really screwing up the other one. And so we tend to see that in a lot of developmental genes. They have these networks that you can't really, there's not a lot of wiggle room. But even though they evolve very slowly, they do still evolve. So when you have two separate lineages that then come back together, what you can actually have is more of a mismatch between gene A and gene B when you have these come back together. All right. So it's really more about not what a specific mutation, not what a Neanderthal DNA mutation is doing in the
Mhm.
Neanderthal, but what is it screwing up on the Homo sapien background, right? Because a lot of times they can then be mismatched. And for a lot of genes, they're not as interested in the total amount. It's the relative amount that's a lot more important.
Mhm.
Um, as a case in point, um, you may well have heard that in long time past. It doesn't really happen too much, especially not in our lineage nowadays. But you can have entire whole genome duplications that can be relatively tolerated, and over time they save those developmental genes, and essentially you can duplicate these genes as much as you want, but it's all about the ratios. So that's a really complicated way, I think, of saying that really it's context dependent. It's not so much, and again, feel free to edit out the long tangent that I took in order to get round to this point. But it's not so much what was it doing in the Neanderthal, it's what is it doing in the context of the Homo sapien genome, because the Neanderthal is the minority parent here. And
Mhm.
the majority parent is going to be the context that gets inherited with, right? So there may be variants from the Neanderthal genome that were cool. They were okay. They worked well in their
Right.
context. But when you split them up and you suddenly put them on a Homo sapiens background, boom, you may start having some issues, right?
Okay.
So
Right. Right.
so it's like I'm trying to get people away from this idea of there's a gene for blue eyes, there's multiple genes for height,
Right. Right.
which is
Right.
the one we've all grown up with, right? I mean, we've all been kind of inculcated in that idea.
Exactly. One gene, one effect, one
Exactly.
everything.
And whereas it's like, well, a single gene can produce a huge number of different
Mhm.
transcript versions, which can lead to a whole bunch of different proteins with slight variations, and they may be doing different things in different cells at different times. And it's really hard to think of it, at the level where we look at of this gross phenotype, right? This gross trait that we can see with our eyes. And
Right.
of
Right.
course, autism is insanely complicated, right?
Mhm.
It's a behavioral syndrome, and so I think I think it's more about context. It's not as much what do we have in common now? What does autism have in common with Neanderthals per se? There may be some elements of that, but I think more is these variants are now out of context. They're on a Homo sapiens background. That's not what they evolved with, right? And they're somewhat mismatched. And
So
individually, they're not going to cause autism, but maybe if you get enough, together, and you get maybe other genetic susceptibility factors, maybe other environmental factors, they can really start playing a significant role. So,
So to put it in a different way that I think from if I understand you correctly,
mhm,
and I think, you know, when researchers such as yourself put out papers, you know, you guys have zero control over the titles that
yeah,
people
yeah,
put out there.
yeah,
And perhaps that might be why you wanted to do the chat with me so you could get your own voice out there
yeah,
and your own opinions out there and the facts out there. And so, you know, I've seen already articles that say autism being found in Neanderthals
yeah,
passed to humans. And you're
yeah,
saying the exact opposite of that. You're saying it might have worked in Neanderthals. The Neanderthal may not have had autism.
right,
They probably possibly functioned as intended. It's
right.
when that DNA got mixed with a Homo sapien, whenever that happened, the genes mismatched. And
Mhm,
then we have new syndromes, new behaviors because Homo
yeah,
sapien plus Neanderthal was not intended
yeah.
to
It's not
work
how it evolved
together.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the basic take home. Like I said, there may be some where because of their small population, we inherited something that was, you know, not good on any background.
Mhm. Right, right.
Um, but probably more of it has to do with the context of the Homo sapien background, the genetic background. And I think that's also why we're seeing it the same trend, but with different genetic variants across the different ethnicities, because ethnicities have slightly different genetic backgrounds too, depending on how long they've been, separated from each other. So I think that's also probably why we're seeing some of that variation across ethnicities.
And one thing that I think is important to clarify, because when I'm talking about issues of disease that can be a little controversial, I like to be
Mhm.
very clear on my points and the points of the people that I am working with. When you're doing this research and you're curious, you're not looking for a cure for autism. You're because there's nothing wrong with these people. You're just curious and
Right.
you're doing research because you want to know more about
Yes.
what's going on. You want to know more about the behaviors.
Yeah.
There are, of course, scientists and researchers out there who want to do misdeeds with the abilities that we have with science, but that's not the intent of the
No,
research.
no. This is really to better understand the history, the evolutionary history of autism, as well as I think the evolutionary history of all of us. Because I don't think, you know, I'll be honest, what originally got me interested in this specifically and made me ask the question, I wonder if Neanderthal DNA could be playing a role in autism, was also in part the timing of the hybridization between our
Mhm,
two species relative to now I know it's controversial in terms of some of the upper Paleolithic revolution because I know Africa doesn't have the best archaeological record and so it's hard to take that at face value, right? But coming from some of my other areas of research where I study developmental genes and some related gene groups, I've had to do a lot more work in reference to hybridization across different
mhm.
species. And one, these developmental genes don't like to hybridize very well. So those tend to be some of those, those selective sweeps that you've seen
Right.
Neanderthal DNA, you skip over those, right? Because whatever's the background genome, those are the ones that you tend to select for. But there can be there can be ways in which the hybridization itself is a stimulus for additional change. So not just like splicing 1 + 1 = 2, parent number one and parent number two together, right? It's not necessarily just an additive process. Sometimes it can be a stimulus for new change. Sometimes, a lot of times, probably that's a compensatory evolution because you've had something that doesn't like to work together and one you have the option to get rid of it Or if you evolve in a rapid enough amount of time, you can actually also evolve variants nearby that kind of compensate for it, right? So all of a sudden the context changes and you kind of readapt to it. And a lot of evolution is actually that. Is compensating crappy stuff that happened, but sometimes you can get an emergent property. So I am also very interested, and I don't know to what extent we could actually, whether it's just something fun to think about or if it's actually something we could try to measure at some point. But there are really strong relationships between the genetics of autism, which is much broader than just Neanderthal DNA. The
Of course,
genetics of
right.
autism insanely complicated. But when we look at common variations that are associated with autism, a lot of those, the majority of them are also associated with human intelligence. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, we do see a lot of intellectual disability in autism, but we also see the other side of that coin. We see a lot of savantism, special skills, things like that. Again, that is not to downplay the challenges that people who essentially what we would might call low masking, they have a hard time not looking autistic, right? Not to downplay their challenges in any way. However, as part of this broader human story, I am very interested in the possibility that this series of hybridization events, for whatever it is, like 3 to 6,000 years or something, 40
Mhm.
plus thousand years ago now, um, that it may have been a stimulus for a kind of a little bit of a new evolutionary burst in the hybrid species. Because at the end of the day, we are technically hybrids. We may be
Yes.
majority Homo sapiens, but at the same time, we don't have a lot of DNA comparison in terms of modern humans and pre-hybridization Homo sapien,
Right.
to see is some of the stuff that we take for granted right now that we think Homo sapien, is it really hybrid? So again, some of this may just be, you know, philosophical wanderings, right? But I think everybody, a lot of people are interested in autism, and then everybody, I think, to some extent, is interested about human brain evolution. So
Mhm.
that's kind of why I got into it, because I already knew there were a lot of links between autism and intelligence and educational attainment and things like that. That tends to pop up over and over and over again. And so it does make one wonder to what extent um, these series of hybridization events have actually influenced human evolution much more significantly than we perhaps assume. Like, I do wonder about some of those cave wall paintings and our lovely, sculptures, and that all of a sudden you see this flurry of a
Yes.
and while that may well have been just Homo sapiens specific, I'm not saying it isn't, but I find you're a lovely little one.
Yes, my
But
love
I
as
do
well.
I do find the timing maybe not so coincidental, right? So,
It is, yes, it is, extraordinarily interesting that we have art in Europe, and then around 36,000 years ago, we get what Paleolithic art researchers dub high art
mhm.
at, Chauvet in Lascaux. Well, Chauvet 36,000 years ago. And exactly when did Neanderthals and modern humans intervene? What was
So
it? It was like 37,000
I
years
think right
ago?
now there's a
Yeah,
preprint, but I think they're saying for maybe like maximum 6, 7,000 years, starting maybe about
yeah,
47,000 years ago. So
yeah.
and a single major series of events. So
So, speaking in, human time-wise, this is all right around the same time. So it is very interesting to wonder what these hybridization events are having on the human mind, because when you think about it, everyone talks about, oh, we share 98%, 99% of our DNA with chimps.
yeah,
They don't realize then how much we shared with Neanderthals. And then what that means is how much we can change just by the smallest amount of influx of another species' DNA.
yeah,
We the human basal body type, or not body type, but just what a human
Mhm.
is so deep in our DNA that if you just sprinkle a tiny bit of any other species, I feel like our outside features will change,
Mhm.
in the way our brains work clearly change pretty.
Right. Right.
My dog he's either chasing a fly in the air or he's lost his mind, and I'm not sure which, but it's
Either
very
way.
entertaining.
So you need double
Anyway,
screen.
yeah, anyway. Um, so yeah, it's fat, and of course, we're just talking about Neanderthals right now.
Right.
Our species, we know, has interbred in the past with other species farther back in our evolutionary history, and it's
Mhm.
one thing that I'm extremely curious about, and one of the many, many things I'm curious about in paleoanthropology is, when did we first begin to imagine things?
Mhm.
When did we first begin to think abstractly? Instead of here's a rock, here's another rock. I know, we have capuchin monkeys who smash rocks together to break open nuts and things, but I
Mhm.
mean, when did we look at a rock and go, I'm going to shape that
Right.
into something I see in my head?
Right.
And maybe we began thinking that way because we had a hybridization event and something changed in our mind because
Yeah.
something changed.
Right.
Something changed.
Yeah.
And I think you're onto something here when you're really talking about how important
Mhm.
these hybridization events are and how impactful they are in our entire genome, let alone just our behavior in modern day humans.
Yes.
So I guess, yeah. So I guess my next question is, what do you want to look for next, and or what will this research impact for you going forward?
Sure. So this study, we only looked at a part of the genome known as the exome, right? And so that's
Mhm.
like 1 to 2% of the entire genome are protein coding genes, and that's the areas of the genome that we know the best. They tend to be some of the most tightly conserved, so there's a little bit more flexibility in between those regions. But that meant that we also looked at a very small portion of the genome. And we thought this was a good place to start because we do know the most about it. And if something is different in it, it's more likely to potentially be clinically translatable. So that's why we started there, but we are intending to expand to whole genome sequencing. We do have access to certain databases that do now have that expanded material, at least for a subset of their participants. And so we're looking forward to looking at other relatively conserved areas of the genome outside of genes, basically what we would call non-coding genes or other regulatory elements that may help to determine whether a gene gets expressed or not, and when and where and how. And so there's a lot more material for us to study. So that is one of the things that we're expanding on. And actually, in the next few weeks, we're going to be applying for
Yes. Okay.
access to be able to access those extended databases.
Great.
The other thing that we do plan on doing is looking at the Denisovan genome, because again, if
Mm.
hybridization is a potential susceptibility factor, then we also need to look at that. So we do have access to a decent number of individuals with Native American background, and so we will be primarily looking at them, of course, because we don't see it in European derived
Right.
backgrounds. But and we do have there is a subset of Asian individuals as well that we'll be looking at in some of these databases, and their numbers thankfully are growing. It's been harder to represent them. They don't have as much representation in some of these major databases, so that's slowly changing. So we'll be doing that as well. And I would really love in future to maybe collaborating with some folks who do neuroimaging, because there have been
Mhm.
studies previously looking at the general population, or at least European derived general population, and finding associations with total Neanderthal content, DNA content, and certain brain features, like even like a modestly elongated skull that's not it's not visually apparent when you just look at the person, but at MRI, you can see some of these associations. And then also changes to certain tracks in areas of the brain that are implicated in social ability versus visual processing. So there seems to be more of an emphasis, at least in modern individuals who have this higher content, in terms of the visual processing areas, potentially at the expense of some of the social processing areas. That's a little rocky, but there does seem to be this inverse relationship. So given that there's been a lot of research in autism on the visual system, in that it's usually referred to as what they call an island of sparing. And it means that visual processing, for the most part, tends to be retained in autism, and maybe even enhanced. And so, again, we're wondering, are there elements of that that are associated to Neanderthal DNA content, or is that something more broadly associated with autism? So that's kind of one of the questions that we would like to address in future as well. Do we see some differences in brain shape and morphology, and the shape and size of different tracks in the brain, and what are they doing in autism in relation to some of this Neanderthal DNA? So that's kind of our long term. That's one, if I can meet an awesome neuroimaging person who's really interested in this, that's we'd like to do that, because we're more on the data science side.
Right, right.
So, but yeah, we have a definitely a series of studies that we're planning on doing. Hopefully, we can get funding for them. Although at the end of the day, I guess if we don't, we can still make it work. So at least hopefully we can still deliver new and interesting stuff to folks. But yeah. And I will say, on the less scientific side, I am becoming more invested in the Neanderthal as the underdog in our the stereotype, and just, I don't know, becoming a little bit more passionate about that. I don't know whether they were, more similar to us or not. I don't even care at that point. But our very Victorian based impression of, very racist, colonialist, imperialist impression of Neanderthals and cavemen, needs to change. It is slowly. More and more people,
Yes.
I think, are changing. But like I said, there's still a few. I still get a few emails with people who have this very antiquated concept of what Neanderthals were. And I just like, no, this stuff is cool, right? These were our cousins,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
partly
absolutely.
some of our ancestors. And maybe their DNA does some occasionally crappy stuff, but because it's associated with all certain, even more than just autism, like depression, pain
Yeah.
sensitivity, all this stuff, right? But they may have also been a really integral part in our own brain evolution. So, like, they don't need the bad PR. They're dead. They can't even, like, defend themselves. Yeah. So anyways.
Exactly. So I'm a little curious as to how this research kind of started.
Mhm.
So
Sure.
I
Uh,
know, yeah. So I know, you're not the first to be looking, obviously, into current behaviors found in or genes relating to Neanderthal. So how did this whole science start of let's look in Neanderthal DNA for, yeah, you I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I have, I'm by training a neuroscientist. I have been studying autism for years. That's been my major focus. One of the great things about studying autism, aside from being part of some of these different communities and helping them, is you really do get to study kind of the whole human condition when you study autism as well. So
Yes.
I've always liked that. Um, but I've always had a bit of a hobby interest in paleontology and paleoanthropology, and it's really only been probably in the last 5 to 6 years where I started getting interested in some of the ancient evolution of autism related genes.
Mm,
And so I had a paper a couple years, well, got a year ago, I guess now at this rate, where I had found that a lot of the so in autism, you have two major gene categories. You've got something called major effect genes and minor effect genes. Major effect genes, as the name probably implies, hopefully, they have a major effect on whether that person is going to develop autism or not. So if there's a nasty mutation in a given one of these genes, the likelihood of developing autism is quite high. We call it that it has high penetrance for the phenotype.
okay.
Minor effects stuff, it's minor, right? You usually had to put a number of them together, maybe environmental stuff, in order to actually develop autism. And so I was studying these major effect genes, and I had found that a lot of these evolved like radiated. The first time that they popped into existence, right, was actually around the time of the Cambrian explosion
Mm,
but in the vertebrate lineage, right?
right, right.
So we're primarily studying just our lineage. And so I've had kind of this history of being really interested in, some of the really ancient history. Now Neanderthal stuff is relatively young for me, right? It's like, if you're saying anything under 1 million years, it feels really young. But I've been really interested in, and that kind of got me into some of this work in terms of interest in how hybridization may influence some of these events, whether it's a duplication of a gene or whatever. And so ultimately, this kind of sent me in that direction. I know it's a bit of a leap then to some of the Neanderthal stuff because we are, fast forwarding 500 million years at this rate.
Yeah,
So
only a little bit. Yeah,
thereabouts, give or
that's
take a
fine. That's
million.
fine.
And but I just always had this interest in foundational elements, foundational genetic elements. When these genes evolved, how have they continued to evolve over time? Like I said before, hybrids, when there's a hybridization, these developmental genes tend to be very resistant to any kind of splicing or anything. You usually kill the organism that way.
Right.
So those get weeded out very quickly. And so that interest in hybridization kind of pulled me forward in time to 40 some odd thousand years ago in this latest. And I've just been really interested in, how, all the different factors that may influence autism genetics, but including this potential for hybridization and how it may have spurred on some higher rates of autism, possibly. But then also, you've got this other side to that coin of potentially emergent properties in human intelligence that perhaps weren't there before. And of course, like I said, I always like an underdog. So and I've just kind of been interested in kind of giving them a little bit of a makeover.
Yeah,
So
which they desperately need.
they
Yeah.
desperately need. Yeah, and it's slowly happening, but well,
Right.
I guess maybe, 14 years it's not that slow, I guess, after
Compared to
50.
some other things that have happened in this field, that's
That's pretty
pretty
fast,
quick. It's
pretty
pretty
fast.
quick.
It
Yeah.
is. It is. I mean, Pablo Savante, and sequencing the genome, and then I will say even stuff like the Neanderthal stuff on 23andMe. I mean, that's just done like everybody's like, "What's your percentage? What's your percentage?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's spurred, a public interest, and I think that's helping. It's not 100%. Like I said, I still get some people that really think that this paper is very anti-PC,
Yes.
and they're concerned about the potential for any kind of eugenics. Um,
Right.
think as I said before we started recording a little earlier, the autistic community has often been very uncomfortable about genetic studies. On the one hand, they really like it because it shows heritability, so that's a bonus. But on the other hand, there is the potential, I think, for a lot of folks, in their minds at least, about eugenics. I do try to explain to people that weak susceptibility factors like the Neanderthal stuff, it's useless for that kind of stuff, right? Because too many people who don't have autism also have them.
Right.
So, the major effect genes that I talked about earlier, yeah, those have the potential, if you genotype prior to birth, of leading to the option for abortion. And we have seen that with the Down syndrome community. I think they've
Right.
had about a 30% loss of the expected
Oh,
rates of birth since that's
yeah.
been available. So it's not like it's not crazy, right? It has happened to other communities, but autism is so genetically diverse. It's and with stuff that are, these minor variants, they're thankfully not good factors to use or to misuse in that kind of instance, right? So whenever somebody kind of comes to me and is concerned about the potential use for eugenics, I have to kind of I give a genetics lesson, a mini genetics lesson. Be like, no, 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 no. Really, this is just to understand. Like, we really just want to understand, what makes autism tick on so many different levels, so many different types of autism, so many different, everybody's got a different flavor, right? So,
Absolutely.
but the interesting with this is that it seems to affect a relatively broad minority of the population on the spectrum. So, and you don't get that too many times with minor effect variants. So, which I think that's kind of cool. I hope
Right. Yeah.
more people really get interested in this. I got into it because I'm not trying to, I don't get into cure versus not cure debates. It's not my business. I am a passionate scientist. I'm also on the autism spectrum myself, and I am interested in just figuring stuff out. Right? It's my passion, and and I genuinely care about this community, those on the spectrum as well as their families, and the other people that support them, and but yeah, I just want to figure out how. That's kind of my that's kind of my thing. So
I can completely understand that. You know, when as you mentioned, you are on the spectrum, and I can see how that can spur wanting to know as much as you possibly can about something. I know when I'm diagnosed with something, it's like the first thing I do is hit all the books about
yeah,
it,
yeah,
about learning everything that I can.
yep.
And I mean, man, if I heard like Neanderthals had something I had, I'd be pretty,
Be like,
or
oh my
so something related, something
yeah,
related to it.
it's the coolest thing.
It'd be pretty, yeah, it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah,
Um, and I think so. You mentioned, I had a really good topic I wanted to bring up, and it was when you were talking about eugenics. I thought it would be a good time for a little sidebar
yeah.
on getting genetic tests. Just
Hmm.
little sidebar here. I feel like this would be a good conversation with you, real quick.
Right.
So obviously, right now it's very popular and possible to
Yeah.
get your DNA tested for potential
Hmm.
uh, things you may pass on to your offspring, things
Right.
you may get later on in life,
Right.
your potential for dementia, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
As you mentioned, genetic testing is such a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
You might get these tests and you might get these answers, but what are you going to do with that information?
Right. Right. And right now, the way that we did it too, I mean, when we were looking at rare Neanderthal variants, we weren't, I mean, we did find a subset that specifically, were showing pretty big peaks, but even beyond those, as a collective, right? Because that's how we analyzed it. We threw them all in a pile, and that's how we could get enough statistical power, right? Because most of the time when you have like a traditional genetic study, you're looking at individual SNPs like one by one, and then you got to do like multi-test correction for every single one. Like, oh, don't worry, there's only like 3 billion base pairs in the genome, which means you don't find anything statistically significant unless you have like 100,000 people you're looking at, right?
Right.
So this gave us more power where we couldn't really always pull out the individual SNPs to say, hey, this rare one, yeah, it's definitely related. So we just threw them in a pile together and we studied them en masse, right? So everybody got essentially like a Neanderthal score that was rare versus common, right? And so it was those rare ones that were really significantly different
Right.
between the autistic folks and the non-autistic people. And again, that was the same across all those three ethnicities. I will say, I think probably some of the biggest effects, and I suspect we'll probably replicate this, but some of the biggest effects were probably in the Black Americans. Um,
Mm,
I'm really looking for, because they are a traditionally very underserved part of the population when it comes to
right.
healthcare related stuff,
Yes.
and even like diagnosis. That's slowly catching up, but not what it ought to be. Because there's,
Yes.
of course, a very historical sense of distrust of the medical community and
Right.
science, right? Rightly so. But unfortunately, that also means that when it comes to personalized healthcare, they're more likely to get the short end of the stick because they haven't been represented in as many research studies. So, anyways, we're really interested in that possibility. I think some of it may be because I mean, compared to all the three subsets that we looked at, they obviously have the most Homo sapiens background, right? And so it's probably even more likely that they're going to have mismatch for the few Neanderthal variants that they do have, because of course they do have a lot less, obviously, Neanderthal DNA, because coming from that African descended population, they did not directly intermix with Neanderthals and got it indirectly, and then therefore much less content.
Yes. Yes. And
Um,
I do want to just add right there, and you did hit the nail on the head there. The African populations do have Neanderthal DNA. They just got it indirectly.
yeah,
A lot of people believe that African populations have zero Neanderthal DNA
yeah,
because they never, yeah, there's this whole belief that only Europeans have Neanderthal DNA. And even potentially, I've heard that that's what makes Europeans better than African. Like, I've heard so many just,
everybody's got it.
yeah, yeah. So everyone has Neanderthal DNA, and
Yeah,
a lot of people have Denisovan DNA, and a
yep,
lot of people have ghost DNA that we don't even know what
yeah,
it is yet.
yeah,
So
yeah, and that will be interesting once we do. whole nother
yes,
whole nother genome we'll get to study. Exactly. But and also too, keep in mind that with the, of course, very sordid history of Black slavery in the United States, people, Black Americans have even more admixture of from
right,
Europeans than Africans do. So that also meant that they got a more recent influx of stuff from, for instance, European slave owners, right? And rape. And
yeah,
and
yeah,
so they have a greater admixture from Europeans, which also may mean that, and that wasn't very long ago again. So there could be elements where we may be seeing a little bit more of a recent mismatch, and that could be causing some health related issues for Black Americans today. So I don't know how we would study that. It's a very touchy topic, obviously, and I don't know if I'm probably not the person to do that, right? I really hope we are working with. In our study, we do have in our research team people of color, and I'm really hoping that at some point they may be able to spearhead some of that kind of work.
right.
And I'm really hopeful because I think, in the meantime, we are doing that population an injustice in terms of healthcare. supports.
Absolutely,
Um,
100%.
because otherwise everything gets whitewashed. Genetics gets whitewashed, right? And so we're really trying to play a catch-up game as well as to try to not step on the wrong PC button, which makes it
Yeah,
even harder. But I know there's a lot of scientists who do genuinely want to support these communities, whether they're Black people with autism or something else, some other health related issue. Um,
right.
so I'm hoping in future we'll see more of that. But
Absolutely.
we have really tried to make a point to have people of color involved in the foundations of this study. Not, I mean, obviously as participants, but also as researchers in this study. And I hope we can continue to do that going forward. Because those were the results that probably excited me the most. Uh,
Mhm.
I think those have the greatest potential to be translatable into something useful as well.
And that, in the end, I think is what matters, is what can we do with the data? What can we do with what we find? And if it's really just something that's gonna sit on a library shelf, then
Yeah. I mean,
why did
it's
we do it?
interesting, but it's like,
Yeah.
ooh, it's more like, I was about to say philosophy. I don't want to insult philosophers in any way, shape, or form. I should take that back. I should take that back. But there's plenty of science that does that, right?
Right.
And it doesn't end up being used. I hope at least this can be a basic form of research that helps inspire more translational stuff down
Yes.
the line. For instance, I mean, in future, I've had people already asking me, because I said I study Ehlers-Danlos syndromes in relation to autism as well. I'm really interested in whether some of these connective tissue disorders could also be in relation to some of this Neanderthal DNA too. So we'll see. We don't really have immediate access, unfortunately, to a large number of Ehlers-Danlos genomes yet, but
Yes. Yeah.
I'm hoping in the next few years that could be possible. So, but yeah, given the trend, I would say there's probably not too many conditions that aren't at least somewhat influenced by this, given the range of stuff that is already popping up. I mean, if you're seeing neurodevelopmental conditions, you're seeing depression, anxiety, you're seeing Parkinson's potentially. I mean, and then a range of other health issues. I mean, this is going to be all of the complex conditions that we are affected by, right? The stuff
Right.
that's common. So I'm sure there'll be heart disease, and there will be, there's probably going to be a little bit of everything. Even if it's not responsible for the majority, I think there's going to be some involvement there. So, other neurodevelopmental conditions, I will be surprised if they also don't pop up with this. So, I bet money on that if anybody's taking.
And I think that is a great place for us to end off. And I just want to give you, is there, you were just talking about the future, where things are going, but if there's anything you want to add about where you think things may end up, or last
Right.
comments you want to add, this would be a great time to say them, and then we can wrap things up.
I hope that more people get interested in this kind of general area of research. Like I said, genetics is super complicated. The Neanderthal stuff actually makes it a little less complicated because we know when and where it came from. You don't usually get that level of detail of understanding of genetic variants, and so I think it's a kind of a great test case as well. Even if you're not like strictly interested in Neanderthal genetics, it's kind of an interesting way to test ideas out genetically, especially when working with population-based stuff. I think probably a lot of these could be good population markers. So we'll see. We're planning on also in future. I do want to say we're planning on trying to improve our methodology for placing people in different ethnicities, because we
Mm,
are, you know, there's a difference between ethnicity in terms of a person's lived experience, which is very, very real, right? Um, However, that doesn't always match with what we find in the genome. So, as an example, there have been some recent studies that have found that what was it? Maybe like up to a quarter of Black Americans currently, if you were to try and place them in an ethnic group according to their background genome, they would actually fall under the European.
Mm.
Um, Now, that does not say anything about their lived experience. People who have lived
Right, of
as Black in
course.
the United States have a very particular cultural experience, and that doesn't take anything away from that. But when we're dealing with genetics, especially if you're talking about stuff like, hey, breast cancer, this medication works better with people who have a European background, but this medication works better with people who have more of an African background.
Right,
I think people would prefer to have more specificity, if it's going to improve their chances of survival. So that's just one example. And so we are going to be combining self-report in addition to, and there are certain methods that we can use that have been used in my collaborators lab on cancer related studies in order to try and allocate people to some of these categories, which may be a little bit more reliable, because we also want to just make doubly sure that we're not just seeing population differences, that it really is clinically associated. So that's
right.
kind of one of the next big steps with that. Given the trend across all three, I don't think it's simply population based, but there's a possibility there could still be some noise in that data that we would like to kind of reduce. Because the more accurate we can be, the better. You know, that's I guess that's always the case.
I think I would agree with that one, yeah, accuracy. And I think that's it. People always think that science is the search for the truth, but I think science is the search for the accuracy.
Yeah,
We're not trying to find the bullseye because we know we're never going to find the exact
yeah.
bullseye, but I think we're always just trying to get as close as possible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you see it like the differences between some of the media representations of this article versus the article,
Yeah,
when it's like the cause
exactly.
of autism, and I'm just like, oh, oh, it's so
Yeah,
complicated, so
yeah.
complicated. But I feel like this is a really interesting piece to that bigger story. Yeah, as we just continue to add more and more to our understanding. So, and in the meantime, I think it's something that it's for those who are not turned off by the idea, of which I think the majority of people seem kind of interested in it. I hope that it's another way to engage the public in autism genetics and
Yes.
as well as paleoanthropology, and they get to learn more about not just their recent history but their more ancient history. And so I'm sure that the whole Neanderthal autism thing is going to probably take on a life of its own, and I'm going to probably have to give some of that up and not just continually run after it and go, yes, but, but,
Yeah, yeah,
if something, because it's kind of a romanticized topic. And I knew that,
right.
which was why I thought it was so cool in the first place. Other people will too, so
Yeah,
we'll
exactly,
see.
exactly.
I will say I am not the first individual to even come up with an idea of relationship between autism and Neanderthal. There was an individual, Leif Ekblad, who was an autistic independent researcher himself, who initially published it way back in 2001. And this was
Mm,
actually a somewhat popular idea amongst the online autistic community back in the day.
mm,
And so I am, you know, he and I have different ideas. He was focusing more on behavioral. You and I have already discussed why I think behavioral is not the best way to to try and show links. But it's certainly some element of support for some of those earlier ideas. So
right,
uh,
right.
I thought they were crazy at the time, and I am willing to admit that. I was not entirely correct. So, and I,
Heck, we didn't even think humans and Neanderthals
yeah,
interbred 15 years ago,
yeah,
so, I
yeah.
mean,
So
can't blame you,
he,
can't
he,
blame you.
he was definitely ahead of his time. I know he's kind of not gotten the best PR, but again, like you say, the timing, it really wasn't right. So,
Yeah. I mean,
um,
if you were saying anything about humans and Neanderthals interbreeding the,
yeah, the
before
two
Sponte came out
2010.
with
Yeah.
his, yeah, it was, you were, even Chris Stringer, who's been on my show many times, were, yeah, I consider us pretty on good terms.
Mhm,
He
mhm.
was dead against
Against
Neanderthals and
it.
Homo sapiens
Yeah.
having relations. He was dead against it. He didn't see any evidence in the skeletons. He didn't see
Mm,
anything. And
mhm.
then the genetics came out, and he had to
It's like,
admit he was wrong.
God. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, that's what a scientist does, hopefully.
Yeah.
Not
Hopefully, yes.
always, but
Hopefully, a good
hopefully.
scientist. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I always like to say, that's one of my taglines, "Never be so wedded to a theory that you find divorce unthinkable." Uh, that's kind of the general idea. It's a reminder to myself, right?
Yeah.
Don't, because we had some revisions we needed to make on, on this paper, which was fine as part of the process. But one of the, I had found an issue in the earlier, because we had a preprint, right? So don't pay attention to the preprint. That's not correct. um, Through the review process, we were able to correct those. We had a certain amount of noise that we hadn't realized at the time. We had Hispanic people in the larger white group. I honestly thought they had been taken out, but apparently they hadn't, and they were
Uh-huh.
creating noise, right? Because they have higher
Right.
Neanderthal content than people of European descent, or at least the New World Hispanics do, because of the Native American content. And so we had to correct that. And so there was about a good 2-week period where I'm redoing the data and the analysis. And that was right around Christmas. That was the worst Christmas, because there was a possibility it could have wiped all of the results out, but you have to do it. Like, once you
Yeah.
know that there's noise in there and that the signal you were seeing could have been the noise, you got to fix it, right? And we did, and I think the results were stronger.
Right.
And we had a whole nother ethnic group that we were then able to look at and find additional information on. So it was a very trying 2 weeks. It was a horrible Christmas present I gave to myself while I was doing that. But you got to. I mean, you just have to, even if it's not the
Yeah.
answer you want to hear. You got to do it. You know.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
because, like you say, you're trying to get to, you're trying to kind of explore these ideas and get to a point of, you know, you want something reliable. I didn't want a paper that, like, 2 years later we're going to be like, well, that was crap. I'm not going to we can't use that data anymore. Great,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
ridiculous. So, and we fixed it and was better for it. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And I think anyone who reads that paper will definitely find it extremely interesting. And again, do not let the popular media titles fool you,
yeah.
because they are rampant, as they are with any
Oh, they are.
paleoanthropology topic,
Yeah,
especially related to Neanderthals. I mean, it
yeah.
is just bad. But do take the time to read this paper. It was in Nature, right?
Nature in molecular psychiatry. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of
Um,
their subset journals. Yeah.
okay. Perfect.
Yeah, we
So
couldn't afford
give
we
it.
couldn't afford Nature. That was over
I'm just
$20,000.
trying to remember the link that I saw,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
trust me,
It's a Nature
yeah.
publication. It's molecular psychiatry.
Um, so give it a read, guys. It's extremely interesting, especially if you're interested in autism, Neanderthal genetics, and the links in between all three. We have Dr. Emily Casanova here. She gave us a wonderful chat and presentation, well, chat on what Neanderthals, autism, and genetics, as we just mentioned. And thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure.
My
I
pleasure.
learned so
Likewise,
much. I,
glad.
I'm sure my audience learned a lot. If you guys did, please like and subscribe so we can get more amazing guests like the one that we had today. The more amazing guests that we have, the more we bring on, and great chats for you to have. So, thank you so much, Dr. Casanova, once again for coming on. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, it was really enjoyable. I enjoyed it a lot. So.
All right, guys. See you next time.